Good afternoon and welcome to another A-Push video with Mr. Pate. Today our topic is going to be creating the Constitution. So let's get after it. The essential questions we have for today, we have two of them. How were the framers of the Constitution able to create a stronger government yet protect individual rights and avoid tyranny? And the other question, with many Americans concerned about having a government become too strong at the time the Constitution was created, what steps were taken to help the Constitution get ratified? I think we're actually going to start with question 2 first, and then come back to question 1. Compromises. Commerce Compromise. Okay? So the Commerce Compromise probably is not one on your radar that you have read or are too familiar with, but essentially there was this idea of, okay, so we have to give the government more powers, and one of the big problems before was that, as you saw in the last video, the government couldn't regulate trade. And you had almost a war between New York and New Jersey, and you had disputes and problems with Spain, all related to regulating trade. So who was going to do it? Proponents of a stronger federal government wanted to see the federal government control all of it. Proponents of a small federal government who wanted to have more of a confederal system stay in place, like the Articles of Confederation, and just tweak it, they said states should be in charge of that. The Commerce Compromise basically said that the states would be in charge of intrastate within their state, and that the federal government, the national government, would be in charge of interstate, between states. The easy way to remember that is you think of any interstate road in your state. The federal interstate highways are ones that go between states, and intrastate roads, you know, the federal government's responsible for the interstate roads, the state government's responsible for intrastate. So that's an easy way to keep it in mind, to keep it clear in your mind. So that's the Commerce Compromise. The 3/5 Compromise is essentially basically saying we can't solve the slavery issue now. A lot of people criticize the Constitution and say, why didn't they eliminate slavery? How much trouble could they have saved? The simple answer is there would have been no Constitution. It would have been rejected by all the southern states if they eliminated it. So they couldn't eliminate it. It would be nice if they could have, obviously. The 3/5 Compromise said, for counting for population in the representation of the House of Representatives, every 5 slaves counted as 3 people for votes. So the third big compromise is the Great Compromise, so it must be the biggest, and this is a battle between the large states and the small states. Large states followed the Virginia Plan, which said that all representation in Congress should be based on your population, so that would benefit them. Small states followed the New Jersey Plan. They said all states should be equal. The Great Compromise said Senate will be basically equal, so that's, and they will have some things. The Senate approves all presidential appointments, all judges, all treaties. But the House of Representatives would be, as the lower chamber, it would be, they also have a 6-year term. In the House of Representatives, they have a 2-year term, and it would be by population. So that's why today, Oregon, where I live, you have 5 representatives. Okay, California has, I think, 54. So that's based on population. Now, of course, they did give some things to the House as well. All tax and budget matters have to start in the House. They have to. So that's actually control of the money, a big deal, in terms of what powers were given to the larger states to iron out this compromise. So that's the compromises. But beyond that, you had a couple of other things that happened as well. One of those things is going to be the Federalist Papers. I didn't put this up here, but the Federalist Papers are pretty darn important. You have James Madison, you have John Jay, and you have Alexander Hamilton, and they are going to answer the questions and the concerns of citizens who did not want to return to tyranny, and they write 85 of these documents that are just amazing expositions explaining how this new government would work and how you'd avoid tyranny, but how it would have more power and work better than the Articles of Confederation. Great discussions on basically the nature of government and what makes a good republic. So these are the Federalist Papers, and the Federalists, this is not the Federalists of the 1790s, but the people in favor of ratifying the Constitution, they will use these convincingly to persuade people. The other thing is, the biggest complaint, number one complaint of the anti-Federalists who did not want the Constitution to get passed was there's no Bill of Rights. So eventually they said, we promise, once the government gets into place and the Constitution gets passed and we have our first Congress, we will put a Bill of Rights together as our first order of business, or one of the first orders of business. And it's 2 years later, 1791, after the Constitution has officially been enacted, the new government has started, the first 10 amendments called the Bill of Rights are ratified. Okay, new powers created. How did you get a stronger government than what we saw, those weak problems in the last video with the Articles of Confederation? The power to tax, that's very significant. That's giving you the money to do all kinds of government services, pay for defense, pay for basic services, postal service, and all kinds of other things. For the people actually to be able to govern and do the things they need to do. Commerce, we just talked about the Commerce Compromise, but the federal government gets to regulate interstate commerce and foreign commerce. So, they get to set the policy for tariffs and for trade with other countries. The military, so it made it easier to have a decently strong Army and Navy, although they're not going to develop a very strong Army or Navy yet. Coin money, instead of states being able to print tons of money and devalue it, as we saw in the last video, only the federal government can do that. Easier to pass laws, another significant item. It becomes easier to pass laws, so you see that it's 50% plus 1 to pass things in both the House and the Senate, and then they need to be signed by the President, or 2/3 without. Lower standard, it's more reasonable. Constitutional amendments, they still need 2/3 of both the House and Senate and 3/4 of the state legislatures. It's hard, but that's fully different than unanimous, which you would never get an amendment with that. Independent executive. Instead of having someone who's elected kind of the leader of the legislative people, which is more of a prime minister type of system today, parliamentary democracy, you're going to see that they have an independently elected president, and they eventually create the electoral college. Why do they do that? That's not really something I have up here, but you have this battle where you have kind of conservatives, okay? You have conservatives and liberals, and while they're doing revolutionary things and creating an utterly amazing government, unlike anything that had existed before, forget Greece, forget Rome, there had not been anything like this. People today still call it the American experiment because we're the world's longest running democracy. Okay? The republic that's been around longer than any other. But this idea of conservatives versus liberals, some people are saying this government is too strong, we need more individual rights for people, and everyone should have the right to vote. But the conservatives are going to prevail, and they're going to see things that had happened in the recent past. In a previous video you saw the Paxton Boys, okay, Shays Rebellion, the regulator movement. There's a fear that you could have a mob rule develop, and they had several examples in the last 30 years of kind of poor people who didn't have as much going for them, and materially they were struggling more, rising up in violence. So they wanted to have some protections against that. So you're going to see the Constitution does not have direct election of senators, and it has an electoral college, and not everybody could vote initially. Property owning males, basically white males. So anyhow, they do have some protections in here against a total democracy because they didn't trust that. And you have to keep in mind, you can't think in terms of the 21st century, what that's like, and how people view democracy and the idea of everyone having a voice and a right to vote. They were treading new water. Okay, they're heading off on a voyage into new frontiers. So, but then having an independent executive who would have enough power. Now, these things are all ways that the government has enough power to do what it needs to do, addressing the problems and failures of the last video looking at the critical period. But to go back to this question, how are they able to create a stronger government? We just looked at that, but protect individual rights and avoid tyranny. So, protections against tyranny, checks and balances. Checks and balances, it's an amazing thing. It's kind of a concept that was originally brought up and drawn up by Montesquieu, a French philosopher in the Enlightenment, when he looked at three branches and separation of powers. The idea of checks and balances is this idea that each branch would have things that have to be done in conjunction with another branch, or that one branch gets to limit the power of another branch. For instance, Congress gets to write a bill that becomes a law. The president can recommend things, but he cannot write it. And then Congress takes the bill. If they pass it, then the president has to still sign it. So it takes two branches. And as we'll see here with judicial review, you have an independent judicial branch not elected by the people, and even looking at how they're selected. They're appointed by the chief executive, by the president. They have to be approved by the Senate, so that's the legislative branch checking the power of the presidency. But once they're in, they're in for life. They can't be fired for unpopular decisions. Okay? So with all of that stuff, basically checks and balances, there's just a variety of different ways where one branch gets to limit the power of another branch, or they have to act in cooperation. If a law gets made, it requires the president's signature or an overwhelming amount of support in Congress to override the veto, and then it still has to be shown that it's a legit law, that it's not unconstitutional by the courts. And so when you look at different things that develop and happen, these things are definitely protecting against the spread of too much government power. These branches are not working together as much. Okay, federalism. Federalism is essentially this idea also as another protection that you would have power divided in what we call in civics or government classes a federal system. You'd have a more powerful national government, but some powers would be divided and given to the state governments or even the local and regional governments. So you have some things like coining money that are exclusively the domain of the national government. You have other things that are concurrent powers, as they call them, that are shared between state and federal, like taxing people or providing roads, okay? But yet you have other things like running schools and setting up elections that are done by the states themselves. So some powers are given to the states, and this makes sense. These are called the reserved powers, because if we think about it, we can say, you know what? The reserve powers, some things the states know more what they want to see happen. They have a better, they have their finger on the pulse more so of their people to know what the values and the desires of are in terms of something like education or how to run an election or all kinds of other things. What do we want? So some states will stand out, and even we see this with the ballot measure and initiative process, which was not in existence at the time. But this idea that different states have different values. There are differences between a small town in Alabama and Las Vegas, and a medium-sized major city like Portland, Oregon, and New York City, and Los Angeles. Okay, so there are, and someone living in Missoula, Montana. There are some differences out there. Federalism is a recognition of that, and it's a sharing of power so the states don't get trampled on by the federal government. The states have some sovereignty in some areas, although they are under the Supremacy Clause, which says the federal government trumps the states. Okay? Two other things. The Bill of Rights, which we talked a little bit about, is a protection of many individual liberties, and we see the battle raging of what's protected and what's not to this day, but it is there. And the rule of law, which is that no one in government is above the law. And so essentially what you see with the rule of law, you have a president like Richard Nixon that we'll study later in the year. He's going to obstruct justice and do some things that are completely illegal. And when he does, he resigns as he's about to be basically impeached and convicted. It was pretty much a slam dunk. So, with all of that, I think that's a pretty solid answer to the second question. The framers of the Constitution had a number of things addressing the weaknesses of the first one, but they also, in a genius manner, put into place protections that limited any part of the government from getting too much power, divided power between three branches, divided it federal and state, and also had individual protections. And that's all the time we have for today. Stay classy.